many geese up there? Or is it just ducks right now?
There's some geese, not as many geese as I would have expected right now. I don't know if they're still down there or what's going on, but a lot of the ag land is drying up now. They're dewatering, getting ready for planting season. So I think the geese might have moved on, but we had like a lot of pintails, then they disappeared, and now they're back. So I'm seeing a lot of orange-breasted pintails out there right now. So I'm guessing those are birds coming from you all.
Yeah,
we're finishing up postseason banding, but there hasn't been a whole lot of pintails around down here. They've kind of struggled a little bit doing some of the rocket nets, but yeah, that's interesting.
So everybody listening, I want to say welcome back to another episode of Save for the Blind podcast. Today we have an interesting episode about Klamath and kind of what's going on, current situations, future, that sort of thing. So across the table from me, I have CWA board member Greg Dyer. I also have our current head of the Klamath Task Force for CWA, Rob Plath. And then up on the screen, zooming in, is John Vradenburg, who's a supervisory biologist of the Klamath Basin Complex. So thank you all for attending today and helping us out. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, welcome, John. John, you want to just give us a background of your job and kind of how long you've been up in the basin and your background in schooling and all that?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. I guess I've kind of had the odd route into my career. I started as a student at the University of Missouri, did my undergrad and graduate work at the University of Missouri, and kind of jumped into waterfowl and wetland management in Missouri with the Department of Conservation there. And then jumped back to the West, kind of right out of grad school, working for Ducks Unlimited down in southern Colorado, managing state wetlands in the San Luis Valley. And from the San Luis Valley, I jumped down to the Fish and Wildlife Service in southern New Mexico at Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge in southern New Mexico. And I was there for 10 years. And then, I always had this dream of coming to the Klamath Basin. And when Dave Mauser retired, several of the folks that knew Dave and knew me, encouraged me to apply, come up to the Klamath Basin and get out here. And I've been here since 2015. So nearing almost a decade in the Klamath Basin. It's been a great career. I love the basin. It's been a lifelong dream to be in the basin. If you're a kid that grew up duck hunting, you can't get to a better place than the Klamath Basin. So it was always a dream of mine to be here, and I'm glad to be here and working on the issues we get to work on in the Klamath Basin now.
Nice. Good. Are you guys getting snow up there right now? I know we were getting some rain down here this morning. What's the weather like up there right now?
Yeah, it's actually a really cool time to be calling and talking about the Klamath Basin. It's been an off and on winter. El Nino has been kind of weird. We started off really wet into the fall and, getting a lot of precipitation, but the snowpack really doesn't develop very well. We were wet going into the winter. So we were looking good as far as average precipitation, but the snowpack wasn't building. But this last storm, it really layered on the snow in the high country, especially on the west side, on the Cascade side. The east side, not as much, but it's probably some of the better snowpack we've seen on the east side of the basin. And, what we're looking at in terms of potential hydrology in the next couple of weeks with all this snowpack and potential rain on snow coming, we're looking at some pretty significant water coming into the watershed, which is really good. A lot of planning and efforts. There's a lot of things happening right now with dams out and managing the lake for dams out. So there's some opportunities right now with all this water that's coming in with the lake. Upper Klamath is looking really good right now. And the eastern watershed is looking good. So, there's a lot of potential right now for some big things to happen related to wetlands, especially Tule. I really credit Tule Lake Irrigation District this year. They really made an aggressive effort to get water into Sump 1A beginning way back in August when there was a little bit of water available. They started wetting Sump 1A. And that initial investment in water, filling that, we had such a hole below the sump after being dry for so long that initial investment helped saturate the conditions, start getting some of the groundwater, shallow groundwater conditions back. And now, I think last we checked, Sump 1A is about 13 to 14 inches from being full. And it's actually Sump 1B and Sump 1A. They've pulled the boards between the two, and they are equalized. So we have two functional sumps right now, which is pretty, I mean, the feeling we all have right now, I mean, it's pretty emotional to go 4 years with seeing no wetlands and all of a sudden have, 13,000 acres of wetland back in the Klamath Basin landscape. It's pretty encouraging. And I mean, again, I can't say enough for everybody that invested in that and made the effort to do that, because it really was a lot on TID shoulders to make that happen.
Do you have any stats from this year's waterfowl harvest? How was the hunting up there for the 23-24 season?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, as you all know, hunting this year at the complex was really, we didn't know if we were going to have a season going into the season early. Conditions were looking really bleak. All we had, between the two refuges was Sump 1B. And with the years of not having wetlands on the landscape, one of the concerns we were having was restoring that tradition, getting those birds back into the Klamath Basin and making sure they had a place to come and rest and build that tradition back into the basin. And so there was a lot of concern early on what that hunting season could look like. How could we have a hunting program when there was such limited wetland habitat? And, the little bit of water that TID was able to get into Sump 1A in August and September helped change that trajectory a little bit. And then they actually had some water they could start filling agricultural lots, which gave us some flexibility to start looking at hunting access out into the fields. And it was hit and miss. I think it depends on who you were talking to and the day. Just the restrictions on hunting were one thing that was a frustration to hunters. But then the weather was so dead all hunting season. I mean, there were so few days that the wind actually blew that the birds wanted to move off of the sump, and it was hot, and so the food resource that was available was grain. And when you're dealing with the temperatures that we were dealing with, those birds didn't have to feed in grain. And so you had this really stale early season. I think you guys talked to Phil Brown a little bit about that as well. But towards the end of the season, there was a little bit of reverse migration going on. And the folks that were out there during that latter part of the season, everybody I talked to was having really good hunts in the latter part of the season. But I think that early season was really hit and miss depending on, who was hunting, how much time they had scouted, if there was a lot of pressure on the field that they were trying to get onto. Then you were seeing mixed results. But opening day was really good. A lot of hunters had good opening days. The youth hunt was really good. The families that I talked to that took their kids out, I mean, the number of band returns I got after a youth hunt day was pretty impressive. It's always kind of cool when you get those local kids that you've taken out banding and they're calling you up saying, I got one of your birds. So I had 4 or 5 of those kids call me up the day after youth opener. But it was tough. I mean, it was a tough year for the hunters in the community. It was a tough year for us trying to manage a hunting program. Just that uncertainty of what you could provide every year was, a big source of frustration for sure for our hunting community.
Was all the opportunity at Tule Lake, or was there any opportunity at LK?
No, Lower Klamath stayed completely closed all hunting season. And the big reason for that was Unit 2 not being wet for the hunting season. When we're trying to look at how we balance that sanctuary to huntable habitat, when we have Unit 2, that's a 4,000 acre wetland unit. It provides really good sanctuary, and those birds can get away, even if we have hunting pressure up on the Oregon side on the Straits units. And we just didn't have that this year. So when we had to look at kind of a risk landscape for those birds, when we look outside of the refuge, there's very little sanctuary habitat for those birds to use outside of the refuge. And with Unit 2 not being there, we just didn't see a pathway to have a season that was going to be, both a good season for the hunting community, but also letting us meet that need of providing that habitat for those migrating birds. So Lower Klamath really, really suffered this year from the hunting perspective.
Yeah. And we've been trying to purchase water rights. How do you kind of see that strategy playing out in the future? And I ask everyone in this room to chime in on that as well, but talk about CWA strategy and what we're trying to do and kind of how that plays in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, that's always when you talk to our refuge manager, Greg, water purchases are, he looks at kind of three needs, especially when we look at Lower Klamath, and water purchases are definitely one of those things that plays into that strategy of helping Lower Klamath get wetlands back on the landscape. Anything that we can get. I mean, the water rights that you guys have purchased so far that help Unit 2 in the summer, that's critical. Those of you guys that are connected to Lower Klamath, I know all of you, Lower Klamath has, it's kind of near and dear to all your hearts. And Unit 2 is kind of that hydrologic linchpin of that entire refuge, because all the primary surface water deliveries have to go through Unit 2. And so anything that keeps Unit 2 on the landscape is critical to what we can bring on in the fall. But Unit 2 is also really important because the quality of habitat is so high for nesting and molting birds. I mean, the number of birds that Unit 2 can produce compared to other places in the Klamath Basin is just incredible. I mean, just tens of thousands of ducklings can be produced on Unit 2. So, when we're looking at these strategies, anything we can do that helps ensure water, to Unit 2 is really critical to our long-term management needs.
And could you talk to the process and how close of a deal this might become in terms of, can we share that at all in terms of where we're at with CWA purchasing the water rights?
Sure.
Where we're at with that process?
We were informed last week by the rancher that we were working with for this water purchase that he had met with Paul Souza, Regional Director for Fish and Wildlife Service. And in that meeting, terms were offered to the rancher. And rancher verbally committed to me that he was going to accept that offer.
Okay.
So everything's verbal at the present time, but just suggests that the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service funding is there, the appraisals and bureaucracy that you go through for that purchase has been completed, and you have agreement between the buyer and the seller.
And when this deal is inked, what does it mean for the refuge?
The refuge is going to get a little bit of water. It's 3,750 acre feet. It's during irrigation season, which I believe is May through September 30.
Yeah, April 1 through September 30.
Okay. And so it provides a start. So as John mentioned earlier, Unit 2 is a big unit, and 3,700 acre feet is going to get it a start, but it's not the end solution. We looked at this entirely as a proof of concept when we developed this idea and started pursuing it. And the proof of concept is that you can move water, buy and own water 40 miles north, and move it through the infrastructure, the lake and the river and the aqueducts and the irrigation channels to the refuge, and provide the refuge with reliable water, senior water right to anything else in the basin, that they can optimize their habitat and the bird production within that unit. Our idea is that once the proof of concept is established, which we've done, that it would promote follow-on purchases of water rights also in that Wood River Valley, of which there's about 25, 30,000 acre feet there that is possible to move from the Wood River Valley down to the refuge. And that would make a big difference. So, 10,000 acre feet would make a huge difference in terms of maintaining a healthy Lower Klamath, at least the Unit 2, and potentially other units.
And this is guaranteed water rights basic to the refuge every year, the same amount of acre feet. Correct?
It is subject to everything else up there.
Right.
The tribes can call Wood River if the lake levels are low and so forth. So there are some triggers that need to be established before water can flow. But over history, most of those triggers have never been met. Only recently, this last year, the constraints were put on the water flowing to the refuge because of low lake levels and low river flows. But that's, I would say, John might correct me, but it's 5-10% of the time over history as these calls have been made and restricted. Otherwise, 90% of the time, all of that water would flow to the refuge.
So is the Wood River area the only place that we're looking to potentially purchase water rights, or is there other areas that kind of fit the bill as far as being able to move water down into the Klamath Basin?
There's
I was going to say that area is the primary area because of the age of the water rights. The water
Okay.
rights go back to 1864 in that area. And so they are a superior water right to the Bureau of Reclamation's rights. And that way, it couldn't be regulated off because under the standard operating procedure for water rights is first in time has first in right. And those rights are first in time to the Bureau or any of the irrigation districts up there.
Interesting.
And that's really been the problem because originally, before the endangered species rulings relating to coho salmon in the Klamath River required the Bureau to send water down the Klamath River, there was enough excess water after the project members, the irrigation districts, that once they used up their water, there was water left over for the next level of water user, and that was the Lower Klamath Wildlife Refuge. Their water rights are just behind the project.
Okay.
Yeah. And John, what's the service's position and role in removing the ADY headgates and allowing more water to freely flow into the refuge?
Yeah, so right now, I mean, there's kind of a collaborative team looking at options. We call it the Lower Lake Working Group, which has people from numerous entities involved. The refuges, other members of the service, KDD, several of the Klamath Basin tribes, different water users. So it's a pretty collaborative group. And right now, that group has had some money invested into looking at the feasibility of what a Lower Lake restoration plan could look like. And that 80, that potential 80 reconnection is a big part of that. There's a lot of recognition that when we look at the Klamath Basin, especially related to fish species, that what's really changed is the connectivity and that ability of fish to move from that riverine ecosystem out to that wetland ecosystem for different portions of their life cycle. And so we're really looking at new creative ways to create that connectivity and get that back into the system. And then, that has these fisheries and water bird benefits, but it also has these really important ecosystem service benefits that we're trying to invest some money into understanding, like shallow groundwater recharge and lateral movement back to the Klamath River, attenuation of those Klamath River flows, because we see all of these things as additive at this point. We have this historic event now with dams coming out. And so trying to look at water and the landscape in a different way, maybe even like a more historical way, how this landscape functioned, that those kind of connections are going to be really important to making sure the processes and conditions that are good for the ecosystem are in place. So yeah, there has been an investment in that now, and there's a pretty robust group evaluating that. And I'm pretty excited.
Can you give an example of what would happen to the waterway that connects the refuge to the river? I mean, obviously one thing would be removing of the headgates. Would there be a widening of the water channel to make it more like a natural channel?
Yeah, I mean, everything is super conceptual right now, while we're going into this feasibility stage. But I think, the overarching kind of idea is making a live connection from the river to Lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge, and potentially almost, if you could imagine a flow through system, that water was flowing through Lower Klamath and then being recirculated back. So there's sort of movement and flow and connectivity and that constant recharge of that shallow groundwater table happening. But in terms of like what's effectively being proposed right now, we're not to that point because we have to go through this feasibility aspect.
I was aware of a study that Fish and Wildlife Service conducted of the food values in Lower Klamath with water. I'm assuming you're aware of that. Could you summarize that? Because I think the big benefit was to fish. Obviously, there's shallow water benefits to waterfowl, but the food values to fish, I heard, were extraordinary.
Yeah, I think, are you talking about the TrueMap modeling, the bioenergetics modeling that we did for the refuge? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, with in-field trials and samples and some data
Yeah.
that you collected from the results.
Yeah, so a lot of that, that was an effort to, kind of really similar to what the Central Valley did in terms of like looking at the energetics of the landscape, that bioenergetic landscape. And so a lot of that was focused on seed production, the agricultural benefits and the moist soil seed production. But there was an aspect to the invertebrate production as well. And that really feeds back into that what could potentially be discharged. And, a lot of these concepts and ideas are sort of spinning off of what's been happening in the Central Valley related to salmonid recovery, with either creating volitional access for salmonids to rice fields or using that dewatering from rice fields and seasonal wetlands to get invertebrates to the river to address that food desert that's in the river right now. And so we're really interested in investigating and looking into those concepts and see how that works in the Klamath Basin, because we do have this new paradigm coming. We have these big pressures where we've got to recover our endemic sucker species because they're in trouble right now. But we also have this potential that we're going to see salmonids in the upper basin. And some of these areas that we're talking about that salmonids have to get through are pretty rough systems right now in terms of food and water quality and kind of temperature refugia. And so that's some of the big questions we're trying to ask. Like, if we look at this landscape from that historical process standpoint and what we know it can produce from an energetic and food value standpoint, can we take some of those lessons learned in the Central Valley and apply them in this landscape and help us all move? There's things that aren't going to change in the Klamath Basin. There's things that we need to keep on the landscape. We need to have sustainable ag. We need to have fish recovery. We need to have waterfowl, but we need to figure that all out in a way that works within this water, this kind of water environment that we have. And so we're trying to look at solutions that are additive. Everything has to be additive. We have to make every molecule of water accomplish more, is the approach that we're taking to the system right now. And so that kind of gets to that energetic aspect you're talking about, Rob, of like, can we have this big discharge of invertebrates going in there that help those fish, either outgoing salmon, suckers that are within the river, or potentially even fish coming back up to have this resource that's available to them?
Yeah, that'd be good if we can. Can you touch on the Barnes Agency project and then any more prospects that we have of getting more water to the refuge?
Yeah, in terms of how that relates to water on the refuge, I really can't speak to that because I don't know enough about that. But in terms of what that project is, when we look at the history of the Klamath Basin and the development of infrastructure around the basin, one of the things that occurred was big levees around a lot of the historic wetland systems in the basin. And that whole north end was disconnected by levee development. So that Barnes Agency reach, the Wood River wetland, even the Williamson Delta system that had the levee removal a few years ago. Those were all disconnected parts of once really productive delta systems on the lake. And so the Barnes Agency is, what we've done is we've looked at, kind of some of the lessons learned from the Williamson restoration and things that worked and didn't work, and then tried to apply those to the Barnes Agency restoration in a way that kind of touches on all those things that I just mentioned, thinking that there has to be connectivity. We have to get fish from the lake system into the wetland system because we know wetlands are critical to that fish life cycle need. And so what we're looking at is a very small breach that would go into the Barnes Agency unit and effectively open it up to the lake. But then in line with that as well, looking at reconnecting the tributaries that would have historically connected into that system as well. So not just a lake connection, but a watershed connection through that site. So you'd have, the lake would become part of that area. It would flow right to the tributaries. And then what I find really cool about the Barnes Agency project is that it's designed in a way that considers how water management in the Klamath Basin has and probably will function in the future related to water withdrawals and water management needs. And so we've really modeled what that wetland community is going to look like on that annual fluctuating wetland fringe, and what, how dynamic that's going to be. I think it's going to be when it, when the breach happens and it's had time to kind of go through that succession process that wetlands have to go through. I think it's going to be a very, very dynamic, very diverse wetland system. And one of the really neat aspects about it with that tributary connection is it's going to restore a cold water refugia that we don't have in the lake right now. So you're going to have this, up to 13,000 acres of cold water refugia that's going to be available for the red band trout that occur in the lake now, as well as refugia habitat for suckers. And, if salmon make it all the way up there, they're going to have this direct connection through this cold water refugia to those upstream tributaries. So it has a lot of, I like it because it checks a lot of boxes. It addresses a lot of the challenges we've been facing in the basin. It's helping create more water storage. It's helping create more fringe wetland habitat. It's helping address fish recovery needs. It's helping us get first foods back on the landscape for harvest for the Klamath tribes. So there's a lot of really cool benefits that are going to be derived out of that project. So really excited about that one. But how it's going to relate to water management, I think, that the water modeling and the water management part is something that's completely out of my wheelhouse, and I can't speak to that.
As part of our negotiations with the river cattlemen, we were actually trying to model the water transfer permit along the lines of the Barnes Agency permit. In fact, even though it's federal water, they had to get a Oregon water permit to transfer water down to Lower Klamath. But because it was always regulated off, they didn't get to use that water very much at Lower Klamath. So my understanding is that the Fish and Wildlife Service or their legal folks, they basically abandoned what was a temporary transfer. Mm-hmm. And so there isn't a transfer anymore from Barnes Agency. It wasn't that helpful to Lower Klamath because it was always regulated off. So my understanding is the Fish and Wildlife Service is trying to keep as much water on Barnes Agency as possible for all the reasons it's stated.
Okay. When would that, do we have a date where that breach would go in? Or
we don't have a set date and time right now. The original plan was that everything was kind of supposed to happen in line with dam removal, mm-hmm. Because there's new biological opinions coming out in the new interim operation plan. And so a lot of it was like, we may have this period of time where lake management may be a little bit different based on the needs of the dams coming out and the flow regimes that have to go downstream. And so we were trying to coordinate all those efforts lining up so there wasn't as big of a hit on the system based on any one of those things happening. But as far as like, do we have a date and time right now? We do not. We still have a lot of stuff that needs to happen within there. There's some things that we're trying to incorporate in to make it more biologically valuable. We're looking at different kind of wave attenuators in there to help reduce wind fetch across there. So like submerged aquatic vegetation can get a better toehold and not get disrupted by wind fetch, create some diversity of habitat. So there's sort of some microtopography and topographic variability out there for different resources. And right now with the winter we've been having, the site completely filled up. So how we're going to get in and address and do that construction is, some of the unknowns right now, but hopefully we'll hear soon, like we can get a date on the books, but we don't have one right now.
John, you kind of touched it earlier, but can you kind of give us the outlook of the current water condition on Tule Lake and kind of what that looks like and how long water will be on the landscape throughout the summer, early next fall?
Yeah. I mean, right now I'm trying to be super optimistic and, things are going really well related to Tule right now. What's going to happen, a lot will be determined, like what does project supply look like and how does that influence how TID can operate, their irrigation needs and what's kind of coming back to the sump over the summer. But right now, all the conversations that we're having, with us, Bureau of Reclamation, Tule Lake Irrigation District, things look really good. There's a lot of water out there right now. And, you know, even if we look at it from a historical perspective, there's too much water out there right now for the sump to go dry in a year. That's not to say that we might not have to look at a 1B drawdown to make sure that 1A stays up this year. But right now, that's not looking like that's something we're going to have to consider. But that is, you know, something we're keeping on the option table, because we do want. Tule Lake's had 4 years to go through this big disturbance regime that it just went through, and now it needs just as much time to go through and find its place again. It needs to adjust through this disturbance regime, and there's some uncertainties we have around that because a lot happened in that 4 years, and we don't exactly know, you know, how things are going to perform related to vegetation, groundwater. Are the springs going to kick back in, and are things going to start happening that made Tule Lake 1A what it was? But right now, I feel really optimistic. I mean, when you walk around the community, you talk to people in community. I mean, everybody's smiling, everybody's happy, everybody's excited to see Tule Lake back on the landscape. You go out there now, and the tour loop's covered in vehicles because people are out excited to see birds again. And it's not just birders; it's our local community out there excited to see this back on the landscape, because Tule Lake being off the landscape was sort of the heart and soul of the Tule Lake community, you know, being removed for 4 years. That place has always been where people get together, enjoy their time, go out and see birds, take their family when they're in town. And that's back on the landscape now. And it's so encouraging to see how excited the community and everybody is about that. So I'm really excited. I mean, everything we're hearing right now is, you know, we can't let that happen again. We can't let Tule Lake go dry again. But I think some lessons that we've learned with Tule Lake, I mean, you guys all hunted Tule Lake, and you know what Tule Lake was like. You know, 6 years ago, it was muck and it was hard to get around in. And what we learned is that, you know, Tule Lake is just a small subset of what that big lake used to be. And that big lake used to be very dynamic. And that means it's going to have to go through fluctuations. It doesn't have to go completely dry, but we're going to have to look at management regimes in the future that allow it to ebb and flow and go through that sort of multi-decadal variability in terms of what's flooded and not flooded, to keep it productive, to keep that submerged aquatic vegetation out there, to keep those Tule marshes growing and expanding, a lot like what we've learned from Sump 1B. You know, I don't think we're ever going to see 1A go into the same kind of management scenarios that we have 1B in, just because of the size. But what we've learned from Sump 1B is even a partial drawdown really lets that perennial vegetation blow up and get that diversity out there, and those holes get established that those birds really like to use, especially this time of year when you see all these, you know, breeding birds are coming back, and you see the pairs that just want that seclusion habitat, and they're dumping into that seclusion habitat right now. And then you look at the big open water and you see the courtship flights happening, and that mosaic, Tule had lost that mosaic just from being stabilized for so long. And now we have a better feel for how to incorporate that in. So, you know, it's some of the conversations that are happening right now in the community are just really exciting. And, you know, what we learned, like walking wetlands, we can offset that habitat. When we do a partial drawdown on 1A, we can offset that by flooding agricultural lots and putting those through that organic treatment and offsetting that habitat. And, you know, so it's taken time, and it's been a tough go around, but it's super cool to see it back on the landscape. And I would feel really excited about fall this year at Tule Lake. I think it's going to be a good fall. My prediction right now, when Tule Lake settles out, I may be wrong, but I'm predicting 1.5 to 2 million birds peak on Tule Lake.
That'd be good to see. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I know, Greg, when we were talking earlier, you were talking about the drought being judicially caused. Can you kind of elaborate on that and what you meant by that?
Yeah, I kind of hit it a little bit. Is essentially there's a limited amount of water that's always been available outside the river for use, and what had happened is that the claim that the basically the tribes in filing suit against the Bureau is that too much water was being taken out of the Klamath River, and it was affecting salmon and resulting in in them becoming an endangered species. And so the order that a court placed on the Bureau of Reclamation was to instead of sending water to the Klamath Project and the Lower Klamath Refuge, is they send more water down the Klamath River for the salmon. And as a result, there's a big haircut given to the area in general. But because of the first and right method of allocating water under water rights, the Klamath Refuge took the greatest hit, because at least the Klamath Project would continue to get water as long as there was water, and then whatever is left over went to the refuge. But with the overall amount of water being allocated outside the river being cut sharply, the last in right took the hit, and that is the Lower Klamath Refuge. If that makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it does.
And to have a flourishing basin, how can waterfowl and fish partner opposed to be competitive with each other?
Well, I would say the discussion about invertebrates in water is huge, because waterfowl, when it's not cold, they're living off of invertebrates in water, as described, and that's going on in the Butte Sink here in California.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reason that the Butte Creek salmon run has the highest return of any salmon run in California, is because of the smolt living in an invertebrate-rich environment in the Butte Basin. I was telling Rob this story where I happened to be out at our duck club when the USGS wanted to come trap fish, and they asked where to go, and they were brought to this one area, and their comment was, well, this looks like frog water. And our manager said, well, just throw your net in there. And they pulled out 400 on the first throw. And they only wanted 30 a day, and they tagged those fish. They did a little surgery on each one of these fish. And then they returned them to the system. And these tags were Bluetooth enabled, and they swim past buoys in the Sacramento River system all the way to the bay, San Francisco Bay. And 90% of the fish tagged at Wild Goose, our club, made it to the bay in 10 days.
Wow.
And they were blown away at that. But the reason is that those fish, they were big, fat smolt living in a frog water environment that was loaded with, mosquito larvae, you name it, damselflies and all that sort of stuff. And that's what makes fish big and strong. And really their return is based on how well they leave, because a return basically means, okay, we hatched so many, how many came back? Well, if you hatch fish that don't even make it to the salt water,
Mm-hmm.
you're getting a huge haircut in the return right off the bat. So the important thing is that if refuges could be homes for smolt, such as a Lower Klamath, if that could work out, it would be win-win for everybody, because there'd be water on the refuge for salmon smolt, and there'd be water on the refuge for ducks and other waterfowl.
Yeah.
To me, it makes perfect sense. Just a matter of how it gets done,
Yep.
How are we measuring the success of some of these projects? Is it water that we're seeing? Is it birds on the ground? What's our measurement of success?
I would define it as water, from our interest, water on the refuge,
Mm-hmm.
year round, water that refuge management can use to grow habitat, to move water to different parts of the area, water that it manages and owns. Right now, talking with John months ago, the nature of it over time has been, they'll get a call at 11 o'clock at night saying, well, we're going to send water your way into Sump 1A or into Lower Klamath. And refuge management has to scramble and make that accommodation. But if they knew ahead of time, or were able to control that and schedule it, they could grow habitat, and they could move the water to different parts.
Mm-hmm.
So that, to me is a measurement of success is water on the ground. And we see with recent announcements and funding and MOUs and so forth, there's a lot of money that's going to be spent in that basin.
Mm-hmm.
And I measure it by, water that I see on the refuge, and water that refuge management can control and optimize our habitat with. Everything else is money spent, but if you don't see the water,
right? Where's it going? I think that's what a lot of people want to see is, hey, they're spending money here, spending money there. It's like, what's the success that we're seeing? And water on the ground is the proof of it.
Yeah. And what should hunters and outdoors enthusiasts expect? I mean, that success, how long should people wait to know that something is getting done and where we're at and where the future beholds with the basin? It's a sore subject to a lot of people that have ever spent time in the basin. It is a very unique place, and to see it in the condition that it's currently in, it's heart-wrenching, right? So, what's the message to anyone that's fighting the fight out there?
Be patient.
Yeah.
That's the best I can offer. We've been at this particular water acquisition project and all the hurdles it needed to go through for over 4 years. And it's this little 3,750 acre feet, that's not going to be the save all to end all. But there's a lot. The one thing that we were able to establish with this is a different way of thinking, different reactions of support and opposition, brought people to the table. I think a lot of what we've done is shine a light on that basin that others are contributing to. And what's resulted in that is that we have a lot of federal money being spent on that, and a lot of groups that would typically not talk to each other, developing memorandums of understanding and working collaboratively to find solutions. Timing, we can celebrate, as John mentioned earlier, we can celebrate a wet winter and hopefully a wet summer and some water on the ground and birds in the area. They're doing that now. So you can celebrate a wet year. Our work is really going to be focusing on, and the results that we expect is going to be in the down years.
Yeah.
When what will the refuge look like if we had to go through 2021, 22, 23 again? And then measurement of success is that they have a proportionately less water, sharing the burden with the rest of the stakeholders in the basin.
And that's going to cause, basically cost money. I mean, the one thing that we were able to show in the last 4 or 5 years with the Klamath Task Force, CWA, is we've spent over $1.5 million, and we actually delivered water to the refuge that would not have been there otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, we've also worked with the Klamath Drainage District to acquire winter water to augment and basically create that wetting of the refuge to improve the retention of water in the spring, and also kind of give it a head start on getting wet and keeping areas open for breeding. And we have been very active in working with the state of California on getting drought relief funds to buy water for the federal refuge. And we're very active in that process right now. So the real proof is that if you spend money, you can solve the problem. And if you buy water, but buying pumps and things like that don't pump water that's there, they're water that's not there, rather, it's not really going to do much. But the main thing is and the amount of water you're going to buy is a lot. But that's what needs to happen on a bigger scale.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you that once the word got out that we actually inked a deal and we had filed an application for a transfer with the Oregon Water Resources Department, OWRD, I started receiving offers from several people to sell water. And I was like, and one of them was actually the president of the Klamath Drainage District. And I told him, I said, I'd love to. I'm out of money.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have any more money to spend on this. But that is an option. Is just basically money buys water. it's kind of funny in here in the valley, we're so interconnected that, you'll see people from Lancaster, California buy water up in Butte County. And so much was done. They, created some laws to kind of control that. Yeah. But that sort of thing really wasn't happening up in the Klamath Basin at all. And it's scary to the folks that are there. They don't understand it. They're afraid of change. Mm-hmm. And if anything, they ought to be thinking about what's really the value of their water rights, and try to go out and get somebody to buy their water rights for places like the Lower Klamath.
Yeah.
So, John, I remember a statistic that Greg shared with us at one point in time, and I'll let you answer this question. And I'm hoping you have the same answer that Greg did. What is the total amount of water that flows through the basin annually? And from that, we can look at an order of magnitude. How is that divided up between river, between project, between refuge? I heard a pretty big number, I guess, is what I'm trying to.
Yeah, I don't think I could put a number on that, Rob, accurately. I'd hate to put something inaccurately out there.
Okay.
I can sure get back to you, but I don't want to put a wrong number out there that reflected something wrong.
It was, well, and I'll do it because I have no accountability to a boss or anything like that. But I heard 800,000 to 1 million acre feet flows through that. This is the full system: Williamson River, Sprague River Valley, everything flowing through the lake, through and down the river into the project, and so forth. And so it's something close to that, when you account for all the water that goes down the river, which is a big chunk. When you look at the refuge needs a very, very, very small percentage of that total water flow into the basin to effectively manage, the refuge that we put into the public trust. So that's kind of what drives us to, looking for other solutions, creative solutions, ways to solve this, because seeing it dry is unacceptable to everybody.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And there's answers to this. Yeah. It's going to take money, but, it's there.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Well, Jeff, do you have any other questions?
Do you guys have anything?
Do you guys have any parting last words? John, do you have anything you want to leave us with from the Fish and Wildlife Service side?
No, I mean, I guess I would just say I would encourage people to get up right now and see Tule Lake wet, and just imagine what a wet landscape in the Klamath Basin can look like. It's been a while since people have got to see this, and it's nice to see these birds. Outside of the year, people traditionally come up and really come to the basin. So get up here, and hopefully we're going to see big things happen this year. And any support, and we appreciate all the support and all the efforts behind us, regardless of what we're doing. We just appreciate all the support we get. So, but if people want to come up, I'd love to have as many people up in the basin right now, seeing this place come alive again, because it's pretty spectacular. I think it would probably hit your members the same way it hits all of us. I mean, everybody drives around the refuge every day, and it's pretty emotional to, like I said, starting off, going 4 years, for me, this all kind of began in 2020, watching that massive botulism outbreak. And that's the last time I saw water on this landscape, was picking dead birds up in 1A. And so to see it now, going from that memory to seeing just hundreds of thousands of birds out right now doing what birds are supposed to do, that would be, if everybody can come up and see that, I think it's worth the drive up here.
Yeah, I was there in 2020. And the one thing I would echo on that is it is amazing how big it is. Mm-hmm. It's like you're driving around a refuge. Well, you better have a full tank, because it's a long way. Mm-hmm. And it's really an awesome place, with Sheepy Ridge, looming over the top of it. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I would encourage anyone that's never been up there to take a journey. It's a special place to hunt, bird watch, etc. And I think the future is bright, and I think you guys are going to figure it out. So we appreciate everyone's efforts. And John, we appreciate you joining us today and taking time out of your schedule as well. So thank you very much.
No, thank you for the time. I appreciate everything you guys do.
Awesome. Sure. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, John.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Save It for the Blind podcast. You can find our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.